On the morning of March 4th, 1970, a Special Forces patrol working the approaches to the A Shao Valley called in a grid reference and one piece of additional information. The tree canopy was too thick to cut a landing zone by hand. The jungle, there was old growth, triple canopy, the kind that had been growing since before any living man's grandfather was born, and the undergrowth beneath, it was a secondary tangle so dense that a machete made almost no impression. The patrol needed resupply. They needed extraction, and they needed it before dark. The Air Force sent a Sikorsky helicopter up to look at the site. The pilot came back and reported what everyone already understood. There was no hole in the canopy. There was no path through it. Short of men spending 3 days with chainsaws, that ground was not accessible by air. The Air Force sent a different aircraft on the second pass. It was a modified C-130, and what it carried in its cargo bay weighed 6,800 pounds. The crew pushed it out the rear ramp on a parachute. It detonated approximately 3 feet above the ground. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. When the smoke cleared, there was a landing zone. It was approximately 260 feet across. The trees at its edge were not cut or broken. They were simply gone, stripped to bare stumps, and the stumps themselves were flattened. The undergrowth had ceased to exist. The soil at the center of the blast had been compressed as though a fist had pressed down on the earth. The patrol had its landing zone. The weapon was the BLU-82. The Air Force called it the Commando Vault. The men who worked with it in the field called it the Daisy Cutter, a name borrowed from a much older artillery fuse modification that had been used in the First World War to detonate shells above the ground rather than burying their force into the soil. The name stuck because it described exactly what the weapon did. It cut the ground clean. It did not crater. It did not dig. It flattened. To understand what the BLU-82 was and what made it different from anything that had come before it in the American arsenal, you have to understand the problem it was designed to solve, because the weapon did not begin as a weapon. It began as a piece of engineering equipment, a delivery mechanism for clearing jungle at scale, quickly, in terrain where conventional methods were simply not viable. By 1968, the question of how to cut helicopter landing zones in the densely forested highlands and border regions of Vietnam had become one of the more pressing practical problems facing American planners. The Ho Chi Minh Trail ran through some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. Special Forces teams operating along the Laotian and Cambodian borders were frequently inserted by helicopter and frequently needed extraction, resupply, and medical evacuation. But the terrain dictated where helicopters could go, and the terrain in that part of Southeast Asia, the Annamite Mountains, the Tri-Border region, the valleys feeding down from the Central Highlands, was not terrain that cooperated. A UH-1 Huey needed a landing zone of at least 50 feet to put down safely. A SH-47 Chinook, which was what you needed when you were lifting heavy cargo or large numbers of men, required considerably more. A Boeing Vertol in full load configuration needed a space closer to 100 feet on each side to operate with any margin, and that was without accounting for rotor blade clearance against trees at the edge. The jungle did not provide spaces of that size naturally, and clearing them by hand, with axes and chainsaws and demolition cord placed individually around root systems, took time that patrols operating in denied territory frequently did not have. The Air Force had been experimenting with large explosive devices to clear landing zones since the early years of American involvement. The earliest attempts used standard 500 and 750-pound bombs, which produced craters rather than clearings, and which frequently left debris fields that were more obstructive than the original jungle. A bomb that explodes in a soil drives its force downward. What was needed was a weapon that would drive its force outward and horizontally at ground level, severing root systems and snapping trunks at the base rather than excavating the ground beneath them. The answer was a fuel-air concept applied to a single enormous container. The BLU-82 consisted of a cylindrical steel casing roughly 14.5 feet long and 48 inches in diameter, 4 feet across, filled with a slurry mixture of ammonium nitrate, aluminum powder, and water, with polystyrene added as a density modifier. The total fill weighed 12,500 pounds in the complete weapon configuration, though the explosive fill itself accounted for somewhat less than the gross delivery weight. A daisy cutter fuse extended from a nose, a probe roughly 3 feet long that ensured the weapon detonated above the surface rather than burying itself and directing its energy into the ground. The delivery system was the MC-130E Combat Talon, a special operations variant of the Hercules transport, and later the CH-3 helicopter for certain configurations, though the helicopter delivery was far less common. The weapon was too large and too heavy for any conventional bomb rack. It cannot be dropped from a fighter or a tactical attack aircraft. It rode out the rear cargo ramp on a parachute extraction system, a drogue chute pulling it from the aircraft before the main chute deployed to slow its descent. The crew pushed it out manually, using a cargo handling system originally designed for palletized logistics. The first combat use of the BLU-82 configuration in its commando vault role came in 1970, and the results were immediate and unambiguous. A weapon that detonated 3 feet above the surface delivered its overpressure wave horizontally rather than downward. The blast radius for total vegetation clearance was documented at approximately 260 feet in most test and combat employment records from the period. Trees with trunk diameters of several feet were knocked flat rather than splintered. Root systems were torn from the ground by the overpressure wave before the soil could absorb the shock. What had been impenetrable canopy became open ground in a fraction of a second. During the period from 1970 through 1972, the Commando Vault mission was conducted primarily by the 374th Tactical Airlift Wing and specialized combat Talon crews operating out of bases in Thailand and South Vietnam. The precise employment records from this period are held in Air Force Historical Research Agency files, and the number of individual Commando Vault strikes conducted over the course of the war has been reported in various secondary sources at somewhere in the range of 225 drops, though documentation of each individual employment is not complete in the open record. What is verifiable is that the operational demand for the capability outpaced initial supply. Each BLU-82B had to be manufactured, assembled, and transported to theater. The weapon was not a stockpile item in the conventional sense. It was ordered, built, and shipped forward on a demand basis. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. What the Air Force discovered in early Commando Vault employment was that the BLU-82 did more than clear trees. The blast overpressure generated at the detonation point was severe enough to be lethal to personnel in the open at ranges well beyond the clearance radius. And the psychological effect on enemy forces who had no prior experience with a weapon of this type was documented almost immediately in captured prisoner interrogations and in after-action assessment from Special Forces teams operating in adjacent areas. North Vietnamese Army regulars and Viet Cong forces who encountered a Commando Vault strike without prior knowledge of what they were experiencing described the event in terms that did not map to any weapon they had encountered before. There was no incoming round, no warning, no sound preceding the event. A conventional artillery shell could be heard approaching. A fighter aircraft could be seen or heard making its run. The BLU-82 was delivered from altitude, on a parachute, in darkness in most tactical employment scenarios, and it arrived without announcement. The overpressure wave at ranges of several hundred feet from the burst point was sufficient to rupture eardrums, induce severe disorientation, and cause internal injuries through barotrauma, without producing any visible wound. Men could be incapacitated or killed by a weapon they never saw and could not explain. This is documented in a series of Military Assistance Command Vietnam operational summaries from 1971 that describe prisoner assessments following strikes in the border region. The interrogation records, portions of which have been cited in secondary sources, including Jack Broughton's work on the Air War and in official Air Force historical studies, describe enemy personnel who survived the peripheral blast radius reporting that the Earth itself had erupted, that the air had become solid, and that soldiers in the open within the effective casualty radius were found without visible wounds, but with injuries consistent with severe blast trauma. The weapon did not need to kill everyone in its radius to achieve its tactical effect. The concussive force alone could neutralize a position. The most significant single employment of the BLU-82 in the Vietnam War period, in terms of both scale and documented effect, came during Lam Son 719, the South Vietnamese Army operation into Laos in February and March of 1971. This was the operation in which Army of the Republic of Vietnam forces, supported by American air power but prohibited by the Cooper-Church Amendment from receiving American ground support inside Laos, drove west from Khe Sanh along Route 9 toward Chepon, targeting the logistics infrastructure of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The North Vietnamese Army response was massive. An estimated 36,000 NVA troops, equipped with T-54 and PT-76 tanks, heavy artillery, and radar-guided anti-aircraft systems, engaged the ARVN forces in the most sustained conventional combat of the entire war to that point. American helicopter losses during Lam Son 719 were catastrophic. In a 5-week period, the U.S. Army lost 107 helicopters destroyed and more than 600 damaged, the highest sustained helicopter attrition rate of the war. Into this environment, the Air Force employed the BLU-82 in a role that went beyond landing zone clearance. The weapon was dropped against suspected NVA troop concentrations and staging areas along the trail, and in at least one documented instance, it was used against an anti-aircraft artillery position that had proven impossible to suppress through conventional means. The after-action assessment for that employment, cited in Air Force operational records from the period, noted that the position was neutralized and that no follow-on attack was required. There is a particular quality to the BLU-82 as a weapon that no other conventional munition of the Vietnam era shared, which is the problem of verification. A 500-pound bomb produces a visible crater. A napalm strike leaves scorched earth that can be photographed by reconnaissance aircraft. The BLU-82, in its ideal employment against personnel in the open or in light cover, left very little photographic evidence of what it had done. The overpressure wave was invisible. The blast wave dissipated. What the reconnaissance camera recorded was an absence, a cleared area, a zone of flattened vegetation, and nothing that could be cleanly counted. This created persistent difficulty in battle damage assessment and contributed to a degree of institutional ambiguity about the weapon's effectiveness that persisted through the end of American involvement in the war. What was not ambiguous was the weapon's effect on the men who were close to it when it detonated. On the 14th of April, 1972, during the North Vietnamese Easter Offensive, a BLU-82 was employed in the northern military region against NVA troop concentrations that had broken through ARVN defensive lines in Quang Tri Province. The accounts from American advisors embedded with ARVN units in the area and from South Vietnamese commanders whose debriefs were later incorporated into Defense Intelligence Agency summaries describe NVA soldiers who had been several hundred meters from the burst point and who were found sitting upright, apparently uninjured, and who were not dead and yet were not responsive to any external stimulus for a period of hours following the blast. The closest medical analogy in the literature of the period was severe concussion, but the presentation was distinct enough that some advisors who witnessed it described it as something they had no existing frame of reference for. The blast had not killed them. It had taken something from them temporarily that conventional medicine in that era did not have a precise name for. We now understand this as the neurological consequence of blast overpressure on the brain, a form of injury that would not receive serious clinical study until decades later, primarily driven by the experience of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. In 1972, the men sitting in the red dirt of Quang Tri Province could not be explained. They were simply there. The BLU-82 underwent one further operational development during the Vietnam period that carried it beyond its original landing zone clearance role in a direction that its early proponents had not fully anticipated, which was its use as a psychological weapon in a direct and deliberate sense. By 1971, The Air Force was coordinating with psychological operations units to time certain commando vault strikes to coincide with PSYOP leaflet drops and radio broadcasts in the target area. The theory being that a weapon of this size, employed in conjunction with messaging that described it and warned of future use, would influence the behavior of enemy combatants in ways that extended well beyond the immediate tactical effect. Whether this approach produced measurable results is difficult to establish from open-source records. What is clear is that the institutional belief in the weapon's psychological potency had become, by the final years of American involvement, as significant as its physical capabilities. The men who worked with the BLU-82 in the MC-130 crews, the loadmasters and the combat controllers who coordinated employment with ground teams, did not speak about it in the language of doctrine. The operational crews assigned to combat Talon missions at Nakhon Phanom and Ubin in Thailand described the mechanics of a commando vault drop with the matter-of-fact precision of men doing a job that required concentration and left little room for reflection during execution. The parachute extraction system was checked. The clearance criteria were confirmed. The grid was verified. The aircraft made its pass at the designated altitude, typically between 6,000 and 10,000 feet, depending on threat environment and delivery parameters, and the load went out the ramp. What happened on the ground was not something the crew saw. The weapon was gone into the dark below them, slowing on its drogue, orienting nose down, and the aircraft was already repositioning by the time the blast occurred. The crew felt nothing. They heard nothing over the engine noise. The only evidence in a night employment was a brief illumination visible through the aircraft's windows if the crew happened to be looking in the right direction at the right moment, like a flashbulb going off beneath a cloud deck. The total number of BLU-82 weapons expended in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War period has been estimated in various official and semi-official sources at approximately 225, though this figure appears in some documents as a minimum rather than a definitive total. And not all employment records were preserved in an accessible form following the end of American operations in 1973. The weapon was never produced in the quantities of conventional ordnance. It was expensive, it was logistically demanding, and it required specialized delivery aircraft that were themselves a limited resource. What it produced in return was a capability that did not exist in any other item in the American inventory. The ability to reshape terrain on short notice, to reach a piece of ground that was otherwise inaccessible, and to announce an American presence in a way that no other conventional weapon could replicate. The NVA and Viet Cong forces who encountered it did not have a doctrinal response to it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.